Thank you all so much for coming to tonight's experimental lecture, Black Boxes, Censor Bars, Death Maps, and Experimental Poetry with Anjuli Raza Kolb and conversation with Jasbir Puar here at the Poetry Project. My name is Andrea Abikaram, and I am the Communications and Development Coordinator here at the project. I ask that you bear with us if there's any technical difficulties and would like to remind everyone that we are recording this event. Please feel free to keep your camera on or off as you prefer, as this event is being recorded. I'll also note that to access a live transcript of tonight's event, click the live red indicator in the upper left corner of the screen and then click view stream, and the live transcript will open in a new browser for you to see. One of our moderators for tonight, Corey Hutchinson, is adding a PDF to the chat now that includes some more tips for Zoom. If you have any trouble with Zoom during the event, please feel free to chat Corey directly. Corey is also now adding our statement of safer spaces to the chat. The Poetry Project's commitment to safer spaces does not change according to whether the space we share is physical or virtual, distal or proximal, and we extend appreciation to you for joining us in this commitment and this community. I want to thank the Poetry Project staff who are making this event possible, including James Barrickman, Corey Hutchinson, and Laura Henriksen. Before continuing, I want to acknowledge the Indigenous land that I'm speaking from and the realities of how the state violently stole it from them in the first place. In the context of occupied Lenape-Hoking, where I'm speaking, I am thinking specifically about the unceded territory of the Lenni Lenape, Canarsie, Shinnecock, and Munsee peoples. Corey is putting this map in the chat not to endorse it as complete, but to invite you to continually learn about the land you occupy, its history, and its ties. I also want to call attention to the violent ethnic cleansing and settler colonial occupation that is currently and has been continually happening in Sheikh Jarrah and all of Palestine. Corey is placing this map of vanishing Palestine from Al Jazeera in the chat that visualizes the constriction of Palestine by Israel from 1948 to 2014, knowing full well that today, the militarized border and IDF exorbitantly funded by the US is even tighter, and that Israel has been deploying US-made bombs for the last 11 days, and they continue to shoot rubber-coated metal bullets at Sheikh Jarrah residents as this event transpires. This experimental lecture and conversation cannot be more prescient as we take a deep dive into Kolb's book, Epidemic Empire, Colonialism, Contagion, and Terror, 1817 to 2020, whose publication collided with the COVID pandemic. Kolb asks what it means to be an on-call writer, researcher, and academic amidst ruthless empires that mark Muslims, Swana, and all people of color as contagion. Kolb elucidates the violent historic and present metaphorical ties of terrorism as epidemic and examines how the state-sanctioned violence employed to protect us from these so-called contagions, aka the empire's skyrocketing investment returns from war profiteering throughout the war on terror, are assumed to deflect against any literal contagion. She asks, how does the war on terror intersect with what very quickly became known as the war on the virus? Kolb traces these colonial metaphors as deeply entrenched pillars of empire, and through the use of literary figures, Rudyard Kipling, Bram Stoker, Albert Camus, and Salman Rushdie, she both shines a light on and argues against empire's pattern of epidemic imaginary, and exposes it for what it really is across the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries in a post-colonial context. I couldn't be more excited to hear what Anjuli has in store for us tonight and for the conversation between her and Jasbir that will transpire, which will also be followed by an audience Q&A. Feel free to post questions in the chat as they arise. Anjuli Raza Kolb is Associate Professor of English at the University of Toronto. She is a scholar of colonial and post-colonial literature and theory with particular research interests in the history of science and intellectual history, poetry and poetics, gender and sexuality studies, political theory and independence movements, the Gothic and horror and comparative literary studies. Her book, Epidemic Empire, Colonialism, Contagion, and Terror, 1817 to 2020 is out now from the University of Chicago Press, and her poems, essays, and translations have appeared in many venues. Jasbir Puar is Professor of Women's and Gender Studies at Rutgers University. She is the author of the award-winning books, The Right to Maim, Debility, Capacity, Disability, and Terrorist Assemblages, Homo Nationalism in Queer Times, which is also translated into Spanish and French with the Greek translation forthcoming, and reissued as an expanded version for its 10th anniversary. Her scholarly and mainstream writings have been translated into more than 15 languages. She's on the advisory board of numerous organizations, including USACBI and Disability Under Siege, a project focusing on disability in conflict zones. She is the 2019 Kessler Awardee given by the Center for Gay and Lesbian Studies to scholars and activists whose work has significantly impacted queer research and organizing. And now please join me in welcoming Anjuli Raza Kolb to the virtual stage.
Thank you so much, Andrea, and thank you, Jasbir. More thanks, Jasbir, thank you, and more thanks coming soon. I'm going to start by sharing a sound clip with you all and an image. So give me 1 second to get everything going. The sound clip is about 3 minutes. So yeah, maybe headphones if you have them.
Inside its cell capsules.
They can change out their laundry or whatever, and then when they're done, it's closed, relatched, and then we can go ahead and we can remove whatever they placed in there.
This goes through the nose and down into the stomach to provide the actual nutrition.
The ambient sounds at Gitmo are as recognizable as blacked out lines of a redacted poem. This is a sentence from Canadian poet Jordan Scott's essay Lanterns at Guantanamo. And the field recording you're hearing right now was made by Scott and Jason Starnes at Guantanamo Bay in 2017. Thank you all for being here, and many thanks in particular to Andrea for the invitation to share my work with you today, and to Jasbir, whose work has inspired and challenged me in so many ways and for so many years. I appreciate your time and thoughtfulness about this work more than today, and I'm excited to be with you all wherever you are. I'm grateful to write, work, and live on Lenape land in the historically Black neighborhood of Harlem. We're gathering this evening on the occasion, kind of Epidemic Empire, my first book, published in February by the University of Chicago Press. In it, I study the overlapping discursive, literary, political, and medical histories that have made the notion of an epidemic of terror the defining strain of common sense in the 21st century. The work I'm doing in the book as a deep dive into a shallow metaphor. This phrase and its metaphorical elaborations have defined contemporary Islamophobia. Islam and Islamism are a cancer on the human condition, a plague on reason and progress, embedded and insidious retroviruses, ideological contagions. Although I began the book long before the COVID-19 pandemic, our moment has had no shortage of intersections with the research I did. For this audience, I don't think I need to begin by elaborating the consequences of pathologized xenophobia and anti-Islamism. I'm also not going to summarize the book this evening, but if you're interested in hearing a summary, there are a few previous talks that are up on YouTube. Instead, I'm going to share a selection of readings, mostly from my own work, including an excerpt from Chapter 7 of Epidemic Empire, which largely discusses the 9/11 Commission report as a literary work of false non-redaction, and the Senate Intelligence Committee report on torture as a work of performative redaction, as well as the revolutionary possibilities opened up by Solmaz Sharif's experiments with redaction. But I'll begin with a poem written last summer during the intense waves of protests in New York, a season that has returned to us over the last weeks in many forms, temperate breezes and intemperate political murder. Today, we can be grateful for a tenuous and fragile ceasefire in Palestine. May it hold, inshallah. This poem is also indebted to the work of Mary Austin and Fred Moten. While my academic work is largely about the negative consequences of the disease poetics of empire, I also write in other places and other modes about the affiliative possibility of shared states of suffering and the desire for and necessity of mass action. This poem is called Summer. Everyone hears sirens in the shower when it hits the backed up tub water, but this is not amazing. We hear sirens in the hum of the fan, sirens in our bike gears, sirens in our girlfriend's sleep talk, and none of it is there. When we open the bathroom door, the chopper sound is loud and real, and this does not amaze us. It's in our ears, and out of them, the smell of lilacs and lindens is also in our masks, and out of them, a cloud we ride through in the haze of red and blue blinking and amazing. In Columbus Circle, a couple reads out the same story everyone just checked. Bronx crew heading south on 6th, the whole city follows each other now through streets and over bridges up to barricades and around them, jumps the barrier and climbs the median, follows the surfers at the paddle out, the crests of our movement making the Atlantic black again, remembering songs as foam caps on waves because they are good for us. In wetsuits, everyone's taking on the tide, the NYPD patrol boat sneers past the breakers. In Ghana, everyone's paddling out and the ocean swells them here and swells them there, and our hearts rise up with the swell. In Bristol, everyone pulled down Edward Colston, rolled him down the street, and you could hear his hollow clanging, burning a hole in history, a plastic matrix the ballad takes shape in, and they dumped his ass in the river, and it was so amazing. In Minneapolis, everyone vowed to take apart the police and fill out the ear, even as our souls fill. And in Midtown, the streams of real estate fountains rose and fell, and the streets were so empty we rode for miles in the middle of the avenues and stood on the pedals, balance beamed the crossbar. In the distance, heard no peace, new rhythms born of new motor impulses, and the sunset over the river was so amazing, peaching its invocations, intoning the center of experience and breathing with us as we rode. Madison Park was breaking up and the surveillance floods were out on Morningside, and Union Square was getting started, and Barclays was a dance party, and Harlem was thrumming on the sidewalk listening to Pop Smoke and trading city bikes for the rest of the ride home, and Times Square was blocked off and Foley was full, and the Tweed Courthouse steps were paid for by the people, and Gracie was blocked to 86. Then Red Hook was fire, and we were everywhere, swelling and rising, rhythm factoring, thought formation, paddling out and pedaling hard and blocking cars. And when the bus driver laid on the horn and put up a fist and even a little smile, it was amazing. In Washington Square, a couple was all over each other, and a huge euphonium played Crazy in Love, and a man in a gold suit said everyone's outfit was amazing. On Friday for the Wear Your Best Walk, Jerome's on 96th handed out white roses, and we interrupted our good phone calls to tell a beautiful boy in a waxcloth gown, you look amazing. On Central Park West, long after curfew, a woman was being photographed for her sorority's graduation, and the photographer told her she looked amazing from behind the tripod, and to lean her head forward a bit, a little more aggressive, and make the deltas proud. Last Pride, no one knew each other yet, our girlfriends remind us, and this we think is amazing because on 5th and 33rd, we see a couple depleting each other's faces, their masks dangling from their wrists like they had been waiting for it their whole lives. In a downpour, we prayed on the steps of St. John and handed out candles and lit them as the sirens arrived at Sinai, and we're all depleting each other's faces and feeding the block like we've been waiting for it our whole lives. 2 blocks down from Cute Tunes, the Empire State Building is boarded up, and the clouds are darkening, filling with a crackling rain, preparing us for being lost, the condition of moving in 3s and 4s. The bike kids are teaching us to pop wheelies, but we're not brave enough, and one of them grabs us a papaya dog. And in 21 years in New York, we realize we've never had a papaya dog, and bitches, it's amazing. The Fanta is fast and the straw is wide, and neon sugar bounces off the walls and up the edges of the sky. Another kid, maybe 20, sees us eating the dog on the steps of the grad center and says, big dog, I got it, come ride it, which is the least amazing thing that has happened all week. And we're fond of him and full already, and the stomach ache is coming on, or it's the chains around our waists. So fast and hard we might throw up on the steps of the grad center again, which is also boarded up, and shit, This is amazing. Things we thought we'd never see are happening every day. In the sky, 5 choppers and suppositions that the commissioner is resigning. Is this terrible or amazing? The mayor says he'll cut the force, and in Houston, cowboys rode out like kings 2 days before a constable clotheslined himself on a traffic light, his horse running loose instead of charging protesters in London. No one can read more than a text, and no one is sleeping long enough to think, but what we can do is feel our way toward the condition we call well-being, assimilate to the perceptible evidence of an allness. In Boston, our friends are silent, and the ones in Mexico City say all the right things. Every New Yorker has wanted the city for herself. We dream it like clockwork. We dream it as much as we dream in the undiscovered apartment inside our rent-stabilized apartment. When we get home, our girlfriends have prepared dinner and waited for us to eat them, that we had the papaya dog. Okay, 2 papaya dogs, and we're very late, hungry beyond what we thought was possible, and we eat so much, it's amazing. The city wants to live. Our masks dampen in the June gloom and bellow into our mouths as we shout, the smell of the crowd becoming a good smell to us. We breathe long in the absence of cars, of work, different sirens scream all night. We scream until we're hoarse and everyone we know sounds insane. Minus skate clusters, the road is clear and we ride for miles without stopping. Our riding changes, our strength wheels out laughter. We are so much more to ourselves as friends to our friends. The days can't touch us, sigh and siren, emergency call and responding, chopper messing the overhead, mosquitoes coming for our sweaty necks. The streets aren't ours, but they almost could be. We're endless, giving up our plans of single being. We call this instinct in others, in ourselves, inspiration. The Scott essay I began with was published a couple of months ago in Manifold Journal. It is largely about the experience of being granted partial access, the first poet, as far as he knows, to conduct research and write at Guantanamo as part of a media tour. His research was to be around the pathologization of dysfluency under conditions of interrogation. Scott speaks with a stutter and has written about it in various places, including a children's book, I Talk Like a River. Here is what he observes. He starts with a quote from Matsumoto. Increased speech dysfluencies are associated with or caused by conflicts. As an interrogator, you can use the subject's speech patterns to cut through irrelevant and deceptive information and get to the truth of a crime or incident. Dysfluencies are then considered most of the time to be false and should be seized upon by the well-trained interrogator. This is still Scott. The procedures of interrogation are based on fictions, such as The Listener and Unified Speech Flow. Fictions that produce a distorted idea of the complex and multifaceted process of active speech communication. And yet interrogation willfully operates within this fiction of clarity and threat from dysfluency, a fiction that threatens disdain and violence upon the dysfluent and forces utterance to propitiate the regime of fluency. Nowhere is this regime of fluency more searingly evident than in the records of enhanced interrogations which took place at Guantanamo Bay. The nature of interrogated dysfluent speech is of questioning as forcible intrusion, where the entire utterance is constructed in anticipation of encountering a response. At Gitmo, I hope to find evidence of the intimate and personal desires behind these forceful intrusions, as well as the nation state's desire for acquiring information from captive bodies that have no choice but to confirm preconceived narratives. Under interrogation, utterance is the imposition of predetermined state narrative upon the cracks of the dysfluent. Confessed sentences expand through an excess of subordination and confession to become a, quote, national language embodied in individual form. But what kind of speech is this? What kind of truth? Gitmo is where national language is dug up from mouths as treasure troves, a place where voice is redacted as actionable intelligence, where imminent threat forms all breath lines. Gitmo, I thought, must be a place of profound dysfluency. That's the end of the Scott quote. These thoughts wheel out beautifully from the work I did at the very end of Epidemic Empire, and they bring me back with a new sense of dimension and rhythm to the pages I'm going to share with you now. And for anybody who has the book and wants to mark it down and look at it later, it's page 276. And I will show some images as I read if I can remember to do that. I'm going to read from paper. Even as it exposes the horrific abuses of state secrecy, the Senate report on torture also lays out in painstaking detail the instability of testimony, documentary evidence, recollection, and, to borrow Craig Warren's useful term, state-sponsored prose. To read the beginning of each entry in the sampling of information in CIA records side of the chart is to confront not just the mendacity and sadism of the CIA leadership and ground personnel, but also to recall queasily the chiming confidence of the 9/11 commissioners and the narrative they constructed, as well as the figures that grounded it. The following entries are separated by points. The CIA point. The CIA representation that Abu Zubaydah stopped cooperating with debriefers who were using traditional interrogation techniques is not supported by CIA records. Point. The representation that the requirement to be in the CIA detention program is knowledge of an attack against the United States or its interests, or knowledge about the location of Osama bin Laden or Ayman al-Zawahiri is inconsistent with how the CIA's detention and interrogation program operated from its inception. Point. The representation that Abu Zubaydah would not talk is incongruent with CIA interrogation records. Point. A review of CIA records on this topic identified no records to indicate that al-Qaeda had conducted broadly based interrogation resistance training. Point. The CIA testimony is incongruent with internal CIA records and the operational history of the program. Point. This testimony is incongruent with CIA records. Point. This statement is incongruent with CIA records. Point. This testimony is not supported by CIA records. Point. This testimony is inaccurate. Read not just as the record of an investigation, but also as a theory of information, even of representation, the CIA representation is inaccurate. The Senate report on torture highlights the relationship in the 9/11 Commission report between positivism and imperialist chauvinism. At the risk of oversimplifying a dramatically complex set of factors and suppressing the deep continuities between torture in the war on terror and the long record of US human rights abuses domestically and around the world, I want to hazard that the story told by the second of these twin tomes of the terrorism decades is a direct result of the first. Where the 9/11 Commission report novelizes and medicalizes the war on terror, the Senate report on torture interrogates the consequences of this way of thinking and brings American wrongdoing into sharp relief with a supporting cast of nefarious CIA doctors. In so doing, the report on torture also subtly recasts its own revelations as proleptic causes for the widespread hatred of American imperialism. Recall not just the arming and training of the Afghani jihadis during the Cold War, but also the unconscionable use of the sham vaccination campaign in the capture and killing of Osama bin Laden. That's a story I tell in chapter 1 of the book, if anyone is interested in looking at it. Behind the black boxes of the redaction bars, the report on torture thus reveals the symmetry of American motives and crimes to the putatively veiled and obscure, the ontologically, culturally, and ethically incommensurable motives of the terrorist. The black box of Muslim subjectivity or Islamic or Islamist or jihadi subjectivity appears transfigured in the black boxes that obstruct a vision of what happens inside a detention cell, inside Guantanamo, at innumerable other black sites. This effect, of course, is not limited to the Senate Intelligence Committee report on torture. The aesthetics of redaction are an inescapable and visually powerful feature of so many documents provided in response to the FOIA requests. Pages like the ones illustrated here, I can get to it, there we go, stand as perverse visual jokes in efforts to bring CIA detainees some measure of justice, even humanity. If this is hard to see on your screen, this is a Freedom of Information Act request response, redacted so much that the only word on the page that remains is waterboard in the middle. Contemporary writers from the Islamic world have responded to the dominant iconography of the Muslim subject as commensurate with the literal black box of downed or hijacked airliners and the ontological black box of the impenetrable Oriental other, veiled or otherwise, in a variety of ways. In the Satanic Verses, Salman Rushdie revisits the archetypal black box of Islam, the Kaaba, recasting it as a site not of swarming obscurity, a cube of horrific secrecy, but as a busy locus of theistic agonism. He begins at the dawn of Islam in an Arabian Nights-esque vein with shades of Joyce's Carnival. Jahiliyyah today is all perfume, the scents of Araby, of Arabia odorifera hang in the air, balsam, cassia, cinnamon, frankincense, myrrh. The pilgrims drink the wine of the date palm and wander in the great fair of the feast of Ibrahim. The pilgrims arriving in Jahiliyyah navigate a town organized in a series of rough circles, houses spreading outward from the house of black stone. The house will soon be adorned with the 7 best verses composed at the annual poetry competition, nailed up on the walls like so many Lutheran theses. Rushdie adorns and fills the Kaaba not just with verses, but with conflicting beliefs and political arguments. Inside this structure and all around it is the statuary of various gods and goddesses, a glut of gods, a stone flood to feed the glutton hunger of the pilgrims, to quench their unholy thirst. The idols too are delegates to a kind of international fair. Here we are given a picture of Islam's origins, blasphemous to be sure, in which migrancy, multiplicity, and syncretism take the place of an austere and mysterious fundament. Orthodoxy, in typically Rushdiean fashion, is made heterodox in the shadow of the sacred cube. In place of monstrous obscurity, the vanishing point for a globe of Mecca-facing Muslims, Rushdie's Kaaba is infused with prismatic light, becoming a kind of terrestrial sun. Quote, "They say in Jahiliyyah that this valley is the navel of the earth, that the planet, when it was being made, went spinning around this point. Adam came here and saw a miracle, 4 emerald pillars bearing aloft a giant glowing ruby, and beneath this canopy, a huge white stone also glowing with its own light, like a vision of his soul. He built strong walls around the vision to bind it forever to earth. This was the first house. It was rebuilt many times, once by Ibrahim, after Hagar and Ismail's angel-assisted survival, and gradually the countless touchings of the white stone by the pilgrims of the centuries darkened its color to black. Then the time of the idols began. By the time of Mahon, the 360 stone gods clustered around God's own stone," end quote. The pilgrims congregate most avidly around the 3 female goddesses, Uzza, Manat, and Allat, Allah's opposite and equal. The feminist revision enacted in this passage compounds architectural palimpsesting, the history of structures and institutions fallen and rebuilt, with a history of touch. In keeping with the novel's reparative plots of shared sickness and shared apotheosis, the Kaaba's darkness is recuperated as evidence of rapt generations of a devoted people, a collective love expressed in contagion or co-touching. Returning to the birth of Islam is for Rushdie also a way of rewriting the political promise of the Iranian Revolution. In this earlier, more open, less written temporality, he imagines the shift to Mahon's monotheism as both a scriptural site of errancy and as a revolution of water carriers, immigrants, and slaves. Whether we understand these revisions as acts of devotion or as textual crimes against the God-given origin stories of the prophet, Rushdie's efforts to populate Islam's most sacred site with the banalities of everyday life registers one attempt to challenge the received wisdom in the West of Islam as a cultural and epistemological black box. The Iranian-American poet Solmaz Sharif has taken up the contemporary resonances of this inherited tropology in more direct ways. In her 2016 collection, Look, she derives a conceptual vocabulary from the 2007 edition of the United States Department of Defense Dictionary of Military and Associated Terms. Sharif's appropriation of military vocabulary, already an exercise in morbid poetry featuring terms like protected emblems and amphibious breaching, performs the poet's alienation and migrancy and the wounds of imperialist tongues in historically specific ways, by returning the language of the war on terror to the intimate scenes it necessarily infiltrates and often aptly describes, particularly for Americans and immigrants with Muslim roots. In poems like Look, the title piece in the collection, Sharif begins, "It matters what you call a thing," and resituates technical terms from the DoD dictionary, marked visually in the text in small caps, in the bedroom, in threnodies for ex-lovers, and laments for those killed in drone strikes or detained in court. The word torture, for example, functions here in both its colloquial and technical senses. A question posed in a conversation with a stranger follows a tender recollection of a former lover, fond of calling the speaker exquisite. You would put up with torture? Although some critics have read Sharif's incorporation of military terminology as a consciousness-raising endeavor, or worse, a didactic reminder of the ongoing wars in the Middle East and Central and South Asia, what these incursions reveal to me is more than an educational conceit. They serve not just as a mnemonic to widen our view of the world, but also a demonstration of the depth of involuntary incorporation and interpolation from which, for American Muslims, there is and can be no escape. Unlike for the questioner above, the man outside the 2004 Republican National Convention, torture for the speaker of the poem can never be a metaphor. It is part of a war so long and an attendant discursive regime so pervasive that it restructures every encounter, every memory, appears in every dream. In the serial poem Reaching Guantanamo, Sharif shifts from a method of exposing the violent language of the state to an examination of the suppression and erasure of language as another form of violence, of systematic deontology. The poem comprises 7 letters written by an unnamed wife to her husband, Salim. The poem's title, Reaching Guantanamo, speaks to a hopeful gesture, an attempt to touch, a hand held out, and also to the impossibility of literary arrival under conditions of extreme surveillance, abuse, and isolation. The 7th letter reads, Dear Salim, I read some hikmat, human country. The wife sends letters to her. Like I do, I don't read now. He was like you. The books, all of them, can't stomach there. All those spines lined up on my shelf, how you would stand there smelling the pages. Them, they all say the same story, and none tell ours. This final letter in the poem series is unsigned, without the yours of the preceding letters, as if written by some omniscient being or mass collectivity or by no one. The text to which the poem alludes in its opening lines is Nazim Hikmat's 1938 verse novel, Human Landscapes from My Country. Hikmat, imprisoned for his communist beliefs, gave voice to the stories of his countrymen, Muslims in culture, if not belief, in a secular Turkey. Sharif's reference to the poet and his sprawling work bespeaks the letter writer's distress at finding herself separated from her husband under similar circumstances. I don't read now. He was like you. The pain of confronting the books once loved and shared, how you would stand there smelling the pages, is too much for the writer to bear. Can't stomach there, she writes. Even more than in the prior letter, it is difficult to submit to the logic of this letter, to its blanknesses. On the one hand, the text harbors faith in the existence of a literature produced under different, if not better, conditions, an epic that both tells and doesn't tell our story. On the other hand, it makes plain the impossibility of the Muslim subject and this subject's prismatic refractions in the Arab, the Turkish, the Iranian subject, and or as the Guantanamo detainee within the discursive parameters and aesthetic regime of the war on terror. The images you see now are 2 redacted pages from the footnotes of the Senate Intelligence Committee report on torture. I'm showing these to you actually more as a visual than something to read. Though Hikmat once told stories the pair would read, smell, and appreciate, no literature can inscribe this, the present story. He was like you is the hinge that connects the poem's beginning, I read some, to its turn, I don't read now. Facing the shelves of literary history, the speaker finds resonances, but also blankness. Amid all those spines, none tell ours. In refusing an aesthetics of concealment, Sharif's blank redactions in the poem Reaching Guantanamo displace a longstanding hermeneutics of the Muslim subject and the black sites of the US torture machine that makes its way to us through the epidemiological lens in the form of the cholera morbidity maps of the 19th century. Of 19th century London, the smallpox charts of the Algerian Revolution, and most recently, the Senate report on torture, which in spite of the visual confession of its own instability and incompleteness as a document, retains both its faith in the discoverable truth of the archive, as well as its links to an Oriental Gothic legacy of unspeakable, inhuman enmity. Sharif's is a challenge to the overwhelming consistency of a disciplining of the Oriental other through a dialectic of legible illegibility. The consequences of this way of reading Islam and the Muslim subject, an epistemological tradition brought into being by the demands of ruling a multi-confessional colonial populace, can be seen in the infinitely expanding parameters of the war on terror as a revival of therapeutic empire. So again, that chapter contains a longer reading of the 9/11 Commission report, et cetera, et cetera. I'm going to close with a final poem of my own called Quranic Asterisk at the Sackler Gallery. Both this one and Summer are from a collection I just finished called Janab-e-Shikva, after Allama Iqbal's pair of poems, Shikva and Jawab-e-Shikva, which mean complaint, complaint to God, and then Jawab-e-Shikva, which means the rebuttal to the complaint. And the English title of my collection, which is not a translation, is Watch Queen. Quranic Asterisk. All these books, actually, it's many hand copies of one book. The change filter light winks on the HEPA purifier. It wasn't provided by the government after 9/11. At the Arthur M. Sackler Gallery near the Washington Monument, the Qurans are on display in silent rooms. Somebody spent a lot of time, years, to render, stroke, embellish them. The filter in the bedroom also alerts me with a glowing red light, but I wouldn't know how to begin changing it. The cover of the 150-pound book pulped wet, and the dry scurry of bristle on it, worked in wood and lacquer, could be the seat of a chair, the throne. The filter is on one side of the desk. The theory, etc., is on the other. It goes Geneva, Capital Volume 1, KJB, Marx Reader, Sources of Indian Tradition, Selected Subaltern Studies. The exhibit is about the people who laboriously copied these Qurans letter by letter. The ribbon is at an excellent song, which was Solomon's. The virgins, they that are pure in heart and conversation, love thee. You wrote the Quran as a sign of piety. Draw me, we will run after thee. A meditative act, you notice human fallibility because God is infallible. The joints of thy thighs are like jewels, the work of the hand of a cunning workman. If a calligrapher forgot a verse, they'd put an asterisk where the verse fits in. Mornings, we brush the eyelashes and braided escapes from the sheets as we pull them taut. On the third line, do you see it's like a little eyelash. And even with all the lamps lit, it's gloomy inside the construction grimed windows. Fat raindrops just hover like ghost dashes. The transcriptionist just forgot one, something has happened, or there was a wrong word and the calligrapher has covered it with gold. Set me as a seal on thine heart and as a signet upon thine arm. Break, for love is strong as death and jealousy cruel as the grave. The Qurans are peepholes, allowing us to peer back into the lives of people we never knew. Humility of artifact and of human life. Regard ye me not because I am black or gold, but because I am a seat and a raft of mind, for the sun has looked upon me. These tasks, a gathering of monuments against the corruption of nature, telling us the fuck what to do in a world after Andalusia. I didn't have it in me to take off my mascara last night, actually, I never do. So there are wishes on my jaw, her finger. A newer filter might capture them. Refer them to a small star, new moon, pointer alert, filter change communication, dead astral message, eyelash asterisk. Refer them to a forgotten verse, stellar slip, a hazard.
Thank you so much, Anjuli, for being so generous with your poetry and your thinking. And I encourage everyone to get your copy of Epidemic Empire. And Corey, if you could drop the link in the chat again, that'd be great. I'd like to invite Jasbir on for the conversation, which I'm really looking forward to. And to our audience, if you have questions, please drop them in the chat.
Myself. Oh, there we go.
Now
I can unmute
hear you.
myself now. Yeah, okay. Okay. No, the host wasn't letting me unmute. So,
Sorry.
well, that was incredible. I want to add to the land acknowledgements by saying, just also that we're aware that New York City has the largest urban Native population in the United States. And I want to honor the histories of Indigenous exclusion, erasure, and survival. And also to recognize that this land acknowledgement is a very small gesture towards the decolonization of settler colonialism and towards the land back movement. And I also wanted to offer an image description. I'm a middle-aged, brown-skinned Punjabi woman with long black hair. I'm wearing a button-down black shirt. I have silver hoop earrings on. And then I also want to thank the Poetry Project and Andrea and the tech folks. I just met you, and for that reason, I apologize. I don't know any of your names, but thank you very much. And I wanted to say, first of all, that was tremendous. Just a few comments on what you just read. I thought it was amazing to think about redaction through sound, obviously, and I was wondering if you knew something called a phantom beat, which I just learned about, which is in a kind of DJ culture, there's a skip that you can't hear, but that you know is there. And it's called a phantom beat. So the sound that you shared with us made me think about that. And it also connects to the kind of theorization going on around phantom limbs, actually. And so the question of the phantom really comes up in this connection to redaction. I thought that was, quite incredible. You mentioned affiliative possibilities of shared states of suffering, and I thought that was so kind of magically rendered in your poem through the kind of citational expansiveness of location and the way that you drew all of these different kinds of scenes of shared suffering together. So I just wanted to mention that. And also that Tuesday is the 1-year mark of George Floyd's killing, just to kind of highlight again the kind of layering of violence that we're all kind of living through, piecing together, trying to understand. The question of dysfluency is so interesting to me, and we can talk about this later, but I am curious about the relationship of your work to critical disability studies, and how you may or may not see your work resonant with some of the work in disability studies around metaphor. The last thing I wanted to say is that the papaya dog's really good. So I'm one of those bitches that really loves a papaya dog. And I've been here in New York for 22 years, so I've eaten a lot of this. So I about the book. My energy levels are a little bit low tonight, but that's not at all representative of the kind of enthusiasm I feel and have for this brilliant book. The book is luminous, it's so sharp, and I think it opens up whole new inquiries of thought. And as you've already heard, it's just so beautifully written and really rich. And so for me, these are the kinds of markers of a book that one reads many times. One needs to read many, many times because it yields new insights every time you read. It's a book with heft and gravitas, but it also has these things without feeling heavy. And I hope we'll be able to talk a little bit about the kind of poetics of the argumentation as well. So please go buy the book. So this is, there's a kind of convergence here around the pandemic, around the upcoming 20th anniversary of September 11th, and also the carnage going on in India recently and currently, and also the ethnic cleansing in Palestine. Your book speaks so many truths to what's actually currently happening. It's been a kind of astounding couple of weeks, months, and it's an incredible time to reread your book. It really contextualized for me in a longer history, the kind of amplification and reinvestment in these figurations of terrorism, of Islamic militancy, and this, the quote unquote, the Muslim terrorist. But also what we've been seeing these past weeks, which is an intensification of the refutation of these figurations. So your book, as well as mainstream news, makes very clear that there's no room for militant subjectivity in the foundational precepts of Western political imaginaries. And in fact, that these precepts need the objection that's grounded in a kind of untranscendable and untranslatable alterity. And I think, and we can talk more about this, but your discussion on the black box really helped me to understand this. So this relation with kind of Western political subjectivity and that which it needs to abject feels like an intractable relation, and it serves to make anti-colonial resistance and insurgency and all related political resistance a kind of a priori unacceptable and illegible, as you mentioned as well. So there's a few questions in here, largely around the war on terror and the 20th anniversary of 9/11. You write about, you have clarity about the differences between the Bush presidency and the Obama presidency. But unlike others who have articulated that difference, myself among them, you render this in epidemiological terms. So you write, war as such no longer exists. Its full imbrication with security and medicine in the war on terror has rendered the concept obsolete under the downward pressure of the human advancement model of armed conflict. So this human advancement model is the understanding of a diseased body politic, and the kind of rooting out of the cancer, as you mentioned, right? And you know, Bush being kind of scattershot, and Obama having a kind of surgical precision. And you also mark 9/11 as both a kind of problematic periodization, but yet one that makes still makes some sense of the world. And I wondered about this because I am, you know, the terrorist assemblages is part of that kind of 9/11, the 9/11 industry, as it's been kind of called sometimes. But I also think that there's a kind of collective amnesia around September 11th in some ways. And I think that amnesia is kind of upheld precisely through these instrumentalized juxtapositions between Bush and Obama and now Trump. People forget that there was bipartisan consensus for the war on terror. There wasn't two political parties warring against each other, you know, or fighting with each other. This is an important thing to remember. The things that have been normalized from that time period are intense, especially the Patriot Act, modes of surveillance subjectivities, and the ways in which we accept surveillance were unthinkable at that moment, actually. And also there was not a lot of public space to contest. There was really, I had just started my job at the Women's Studies department at Rutgers, and it was so alienating to find most of my colleagues unable there's a gender studies department, really unable to articulate what was wrong about how this was unfolding, and the anti-Muslim Islamophobic sentiment. You write a little bit about, you know, how you experienced 9/11 in New York City, which was very moving to me. I was just wondering, you know, what are your thoughts on the upcoming anniversary? What kinds of conversations would you like to see or have? What kinds of changes do you think are important to mark?
Thank you so much for raising all of these questions, and also just for the seriousness and like attention and detail with which you've read this book. It's really meaningful to me. And I also want to say thank you for Terrorist Assemblages, because that book, you know, it came out right before I started writing my dissertation, or maybe my second year of graduate school. And I didn't have the misfortune of not having that book. In other words, the conversation was already open to me because your book existed. And for all of the, you know, difficulty and alienation of producing work about something that is live and unpopular and makes people uncomfortable, I knew that it was possible because of your work. And that was, you know, I studied it. I studied it like the Bible. So I think, but yes, both of us have produced work, and I'm not sure about you, but I've also, you know, I've been, I think, I mean, without having taken it, I've been the recipient of State Department funding. And I think I'm also working on an essay right now for the 20th anniversary of September 11th about the specific impact of 9/11 on higher education, the way that the financing of a new Orientalist endeavor in the 21st century changed higher ed, changed departments, changed hires, all these institutes for Arab studies. The scholarship I received from the State Department was basically a CIA recruitment operation for people who were studying. Some of you have heard me tell this story/joke before, but it was a critical languages scholarship. And I was like, oh, cool, like languages in which there's cool criticism and poetic theory, critical for national security. I was very naive. So, I mean, I would like to see us in the academy having that conversation about the changes to to education. But more broadly, I think we need to reckon with the profound hysteria of those 10 years after 9/11, the normalization of, exactly as you said, the normalization of completely evil and preposterous violations of civil rights here, violations of human rights law and international laws of war abroad. I start the book with the Osama bin Laden assassination and the sham vaccination campaign, violations of sovereignty. I mean, to actually hold the US accountable for the war crimes that have been committed over the last 20 years is, I think, that's the part of 9/11 I would like to never forget. There are other things that have been on my mind. I mean, I think just to give it some emotional dimension, it's also just sick and disgusting, the tourism industry around 9/11. I don't know, my girlfriend used to work across the street from the World Trade Center, so I was down there more than I wanted to be. And this is like a space in New York City where it's really scary to be a Muslim. Like, the way that 9/11 was physically memorialized in this city also means that there's people coming from all around the country who believe that this is like a signal site for grief and for mourning the loss of American sovereignty and military power. And so the grief industry is sort of separate, I would say, from the knowledge making industry of 9/11, but it's one that I am really dreading. We don't in this country, I don't think, grieve about the right things when it comes to that event. And I would just, I've mentioned this in a couple of places, but I would also just point everybody here to the lovely chapter in Carla Cornejo Villavicencio's book, The Undocumented Americans. She has an amazing chapter about 9/11 and about the undocumented workers who were there when the towers fell, and then also who were conscripted without papers into cleanup operations, who then were not medically supported by the state because their names were not on the rolls, on the rosters. So I don't know. I mean, those are a few conversations I'd like to see happening in the upcoming months. I don't feel that sanguine that they're the ones that we're going to be having, at least in the kind of legacy publications, but hopefully in these spaces.
Yeah, I was thinking when you mentioned the kind of restructuring of funding streams and also educational opportunities through this surveillance apparatuses, right? Where lots of universities had been asked, their faculty had been asked to, basically report on their students, in terms of especially Muslim, particularly Muslim students, right, or American Muslim students. I also just wanted to mention that this is still really a live issue around Title VI funding, right? Because it's being used by the Department of Education to modulate what kind of Palestine speech is allowed, basically none, on campus, right? So we're still dealing with, the kind of disciplining and policing of the restructuring of the way universities get money, right, from various pools. That's still going on.
I'm going to interrupt you for 1 second to also add that, like, my own university right now, the University of Toronto, has been censured by the Canadian Association of Teachers for denying a job offer to a woman who was supposed to head up the Human Rights Institute for writings on Palestine. So this American imperialism stretches its tentacles across the border as well.
Yeah, and there's also something just recently too that happened. The Education, Diversity, and Inclusion officer, I think, had also just today or yesterday been called on to be fired, actually, because of expressing pro-Palestinian views. So I don't have many more details about that, but that's like an emergent story from the last 24 hours. Yeah. I guess I also just wanted to mention, the way that you were talking about redaction, and also the way you laid out the bullet points. It did make me think about, I can't remember the name of the list, but the way in which people who were undocumented and people who were in danger of being deported right after 9/11 were encouraged to show up and sign up on the NEARS list, I think it was, right?
Yeah.
And so that, that whole communities were affected by that literary form of the list, right? What it meant to go and list yourself, and the kinds of preemptive deportations or preemptive departures that happened, particularly to Pakistan, right? And to the kind of emptying out of Pakistani communities in Brooklyn in specific. So just these different forms, administrative, bureaucratic forms of surveillance kind of connect up with the way in which you laid out the way redaction works to, to surveil, really. We are talking a little bit about Palestine. I wanted to, again, it was really quite stunning to reread your book in the context of the last few weeks. I was thinking about what you said in your poem. Things we thought we'd never see are happening. Things we thought we'd never see are happening every day, right? And so there's been a bit of that feeling as well in the last weeks around Palestine. I was listening to a panel today where Omar Jabri Salamanca was talking about the sheer force of what he called an unreadable anti-colonial rebellion, and which connects to your the kind of ontological black box that you're talking about. And he mentioned also the Haitian Revolution, right, which was unthinkable even as it was happening, right? And we also see, Palestinians being described as a virus, as a plague by settlers, by Israeli 49ers, right? So all of these things are converging here. I was wondering if you wanted to, you mentioned Palestine in the book, but what are your thoughts on the relevance of your work to the current uprisings in Palestine?
Well, let me start by just shouting out like The Right to Maim, from which I learned a lot. I also really like Sophia Robbins's book on trash collection in Palestine. That's one that meant a lot to me, because mostly what I've been thinking about is infrastructure. Let me put that on hold for a second and say a couple of quicker things. With regard to the continued pathologization of Palestinians, the virus discourse, the plague discourse, I was also thinking about your question earlier about the kind of affordances of critical disability studies and whether or not it makes sense to think about, well, tell me what you think about this. I've been watching especially the deliberate murder of large parts of whole families as a state-sanctioned form of excruciating violence, not simply carpet bombing, but targeting specific families to decimate genetic lines and social cohesion. And one of the things that's been on my mind is about whether we can think about that, whether it's useful to think about that or helpful to think about that as a kind of deliberate maiming or deliberate disabling. To dismember a family literally in that way as a strategy of war brought me back oddly to one of the first things that sort of radicalized me as a young person when I was like 11, which was the use of systematic rape in Bosnia as a strategy for war. That kind of psychological that criminality and violence, it's really been striking me this past couple of weeks. And I don't generally go in for the women and children discourse, but it's really truly astonishing in this context what in fact is being done to, and I think we have to think about this in relationship to forced sterilization of Palestinian people in the Israeli territories, which has been a medical scandal for the last 7-8 years. So that's one thing that I've been thinking about. My book doesn't say anything about any of this, so I'm just thinking now live and out loud. What I think the book probably offers on these topics is some of the imperial background that can help us to understand Israel's actions now. I was pretty studious about not studious, but I just avoided the I avoided the territory of Palestine in part because I don't read Arabic. And so I didn't have access to the primary texts. It's something that I really want to do, but I don't have now. And also because the imperial formation of Israel doesn't follow exactly the same blueprint as those big 19th century empires. And those are the ones that, because of their massiveness, rather than their targeted violence, share this like relationship to epidemic or pandemic because they circumscribe global space in this pretty particular way. And they enabled exactly the spread of disease that they then started using as a metaphor to describe their oppressed peoples. Mm-hmm. Israel doesn't have that territorial expansion that that creates networks for epidemic spread. And so for me, it was a way of delineating what was already a really massive book, and just saying, like, I hope it's a useful way of triangulating. But yeah, I don't say much about Palestine, as you know.
Yeah, I didn't mean to put you on the spot about that at all. I more meant to kind of accentuate the way that your book allows for a kind of deeper comprehension of the kind of intractability of like talking about Hamas in some reasonable way, right? Yeah. Or not continually like why it's so impossible to disrupt mainstream media discourse on this characterization of Arab Israelis, right? When Palestinians continue to say, actually, we're Palestinian, we're not Arab Israelis. And so just that intractable refusal, you know, I really saw, you know, your book explaining and kind of encapsulating the sheer force of it, right? Which is, these are, again, this is about Western political subjectivities, and it's not about knowledge, and it's not about educating people. It's really an absolute refusal that's been built into these political subjectivities in terms of what is violence, what is not violence, what is terrorism, what is not terrorism, all of these things that you parse out. I absolutely, just a quick comment on the right to maim, I absolutely think that that these are forms of deliberate maiming. I guess I hadn't since 1948 hadn't seen this extent of the wiping out of families, right? So that's also been just unbelievably jolting and I think traumatic to, you know, the people that I've been supporting these past weeks and the kind of solidarity networks. But these are about destroying genetic lines, and the connection to forced sterilization is really important. It's also connected to the intergenerational trauma, right? Which has become a discourse about Palestine, a colonial discourse about Palestine, a discourse that Fanon warns us about, right? Which is trauma kind of ascribed to the colonized. And so there's a kind of interesting negotiation of the notion of trauma always going on, because it's an imposition, but it's also it's a colonial imposition, but it's also not true, right? And so so just that absolutely to me has been you know, reading to me as a merging of maiming and killing, because it is a literal killing, but it is also about a maiming of futurity, a maiming of resistance, and as kind of the way that I've described maiming is an attempt to strip the possibilities of the next intifada, right? And so this is exactly, if you take maiming as that definition, I think that's absolutely right. And yeah, so I'll leave it there with the right to maim stuff. You had mentioned.
I have to add one more thing on this. I mean, I'm just just too excited to get to talk to you about this to be totally quiet. But like, okay, so the other thing that's so amazing, I will say, I think the two moments in the book that really like that I've been thinking about a lot over the last 11 days are the way that, so this just gets back to your point about the illegibility, the like legible illegibility or the forced illegibility of the revolutionary subject. So in the Indian Mutiny of 1857 and then in the Algerian uprising, it's the exact same refusal to recognize the demand. And so what is named instead of the demand for freedom is virality, is pathology. So our very desire for freedom is pathologized in this way. And there's this really consistent 200-year history of performative naivete on the part of imperialists who say, we don't know what you want. You're just religious fanatics. This is just spreading. But the example that you just gave is such an important, I mean, every single thing about what they do belies this strategic and performative refusal to comprehend the demand for freedom. But you cannot say both, we don't know what you want, stop this Hamas craziness, and then also we're going to eradicate your people and any hope that you have. So in fact, I think that family maiming gesture to me is the greatest admission of, we know exactly the fuck what you want. We're just going to pretend that we can't recognize it or
yeah, because it's an assault on futurity. It's a complete utter assault on the possibility of existence, right? So and a free existence. It's utterly painful to be watching the, you know, the kind of refute the there's been such a surge of Palestinian voices and disruptions and conversation and dialogue, and then to watch the kind of refusal for any of that to shift in a mainstream sense, but also I just think in an ideological sense. I know everyone's, you know, really, really energized by new forms of solidarity that are emerging, and I feel positive and kind of working towards those openings as well. But your book tells us that there's no easy disruption, right? And that an anti-colonial insurgency is never going to be a legitimate form of resistance ever. So with that, I wanted to return to something you said about grief and how we don't, the grief industry and how we don't grieve the right things. And it's I'll tell you a little story about why I thought that was funny, but you know, these past weeks we've been watching Twitter become this kind of repository of grief and also fortitude, but grief about the elsewhere, right? About India, about Palestine, about Colombia. The word that I've heard the most often uttered by those of us who straddle multiple geographies is the word dissonance. There's a dissonance between here and there, right? We're returning to normal, but you know, what kind of world are we constructing when we embrace this sentiment? You know, while, for example, India continues to be in an unbelievable crisis around the pandemic. You wrote in a response piece to, I guess, a forum on your book that's forthcoming about how you cried after the capture and cried a lot after the capture and killing of Osama bin Laden. And I could really feel that. I could feel that pain. And I think this is, you know, linked to the American Muslim and what you call the ontological black box. And you said this sentence already, but I'm going to say it again. That the crying seemed to me to be related to what you describe as, quote, the depth of involuntary incorporation and interpolation from which, for American Muslims, there is and can be no escape, right? So the legible illegibility that is a kind of endless circuitry of denial and refusal. And I just wondered what you think about this really intense grief plus this dissonance. You know, is this a condition of diaspora for many of us? And I just wanted to add, you know, I relate to this in a different way. I grew up in a Sikh family committed to the Khalistani movement, a separatist Sikh homeland in the 70s and 80s in New Jersey. So when Indira Gandhi was assassinated, for whatever reason, I was compelled to write an op-ed for my school newspaper explaining why her death was not something grievable, that it was not something worth grieving by those of us who were oppressed by her regime. And, you know, this did not go over well at all. But I remember,
I can't imagine it did.
I still have this op-ed. It's pretty good, actually.
Send it right now, please.
I probably have it somewhere. It didn't go over well. I remember thinking at that time, you know, we will never be thought of as anything other than how we are thought of now, right? As a terrorist, right? As terrorists. So anyway, I wanted to share that with you Also, but just to think about the condition of diaspora, that is the conditions of possibility is about figuring out the kind of grief of this dissonance.
I have been, well, okay, a couple of sort of excuses to start with or whatever. It feels important to me to say that my thoughts on this are extremely conditioned by being in certain contexts white passing, not in the academy. This has been kind of a shock for me, but a white passing cis femme person with a Hindu name, which was just a kind of, that was my parents' choice. My first name is Hindu. So I'm not immediately legible as a Muslim. I'm also not a man. My brother has certainly had a much harder time at airports and so forth than I have. As of my cousins who are all Sayyids. So I think my experience, okay, so there's that. I also want to say that I haven't in the past really gone in for this, or like I've been suspicious or a bit hesitant about shared conditions of diasporic subjectivity, particularly because of the way that American immigration law created a class essentially of a number of classes, but including bourgeois, highly educated immigrants from South Asia in the 1960s and 70s. So the diasporic condition has actually, for me, come into being probably more strongly in these last 3 weeks than it had since the Bin Laden assassination. That is to say, like in moments of distance where in fact I can't go back to Pakistan, and also where I know extreme violence and suffering is happening there. It's this kind of just very simple attunement to the people who are still there, and the sometimes possibility and impossibilities of just being there in person and bearing witness. I'm in an Asian American writers group, and it's been a very fascinating. I mean, it's multi-Asian in all the ways that our demographic categories like do and don't capture on census forms, but it's been totally phenomenal and incredible to have conversations with writers who are essentially have like become the language and essay barometers of like these spikes in hate crimes and then shifting conversations. And then there was a week where like every Asian American writer had something to say about what was going on in terms of hate crimes in California and the shooting in Atlanta. I mean, the speed of inhabiting a life and inhabiting a diaspora and inhabiting a family and a body as it lines up with news cycles, I think it's shallow and it makes me embarrassed, but it's also really material and really real. We're like called into community in these unexpected ways. And I don't know, maybe I want to go back to that. Here's what I'll say to conclude. I do maybe want to go back to that question about whether there is a shared diasporic condition, because I've really been feeling it. And I don't know if that's intellectually rigorous. So I think my avenue to get there is to think more about immigration history and why we are here, in fact, why we're here, why we were allowed to be here, and how we've been treated since we got here.
I raise that too because you did talk about in your first poem the kind of affiliative possibilities of shared states of suffering, and I loved how non-diasporically oriented that presentation was, right? Because the locational locational renderings were, went beyond these kind of news spikes around who's being interpolated as a kind of casualty of US racism. I think this is obviously one of the concerns about the ceasefire right now, right? That it will dissipate the kind of news cycle. And this is also about what maiming is and what it does in terms of temporality, right? The injury is spectacular, but what is left in the wake, or what has to be dealt with in the wake, is never newsworthy. And that's why it's important to pay attention to the supposed aftermath, right, of violence. I wanted to kind of continue on this a little bit. You know that there are kind of debates about the notion of terrorism and this kind of intractable relation with Islam. Do we expand who we call a terrorist? This has been a kind of traditional stance of the left. It's been an easy stance, right, of the white left, really. But it renders a kind of ambiguous result, right? So, yay, we include white nationalist violence as terrorism. But then we also have like Black Lives Matter kind of designated as a terrorist organization, right, in various spheres. So are we, what do you think about the diversification of who can be a terrorist and what can be terrorism? Does it only further serve to legitimize normative frames of what is violent, what is not violent? And then in the book, you also talk about kind of anarchist terrorism and revolutionary terrorism, I think in distinction to Islamist terrorism. And one of the reasons why I've been thinking about this, I think I know probably the contours of your response. One of the reasons why I've been thinking about this is I was at a rally last week, and one of the new banners was "Zionism is terrorism," and I just thought, oh, I don't know if we want to go there. I was feeling confused and ambivalent, and I started kind of debating the organizers about this, and it makes me concerned. But then I also think, and their argument is that Palestinians are having experiences of terror on multiple scales, and there's clearly terrorizing going on. So what do you think? And I think here too, we're talking about what are the boundaries, if there are any, between militancy and terrorism as well.
I love this question, and I said that I wanted to talk about this one specifically because I really want to know what you think about this. So I think I sense your hesitation, but I want to throw it back to you after I say a couple things. So basically, no, I don't think it's and I don't think it's useful to expand the definition of who counts as a terrorist. And I will also add, this feels like it holds for me too in terms of repurposing the virus metaphor, although I'm so down with the place that it comes from, but I am not about this, the real virus is white supremacy. The real virus is to me, both of those terms and their interlinking. I mean, this is what the book is about. Both of those terms, virus and terrorism, are, they are portals that open into a possibility of a complete disregard for the law, for any sense of ethics. It's the space beyond which there is no beyond the pale. To call someone a terrorist is to allow for any manner of retribution or abuse. So to me, the expansion of the category is not what we need. It's already a mess of a category legally. And I think all it does is index dehumanization. Same with the virus. I don't want, look, this is the part that's hard for me. I can't say that I have a whole lot of faith in international law. I can't say that I think that, taking Israel to The Hague is going to, or taking the white supremacists who stormed the Capitol on January 6th, for war crimes or treason. I don't think this is going to legally follow a great path that I feel super happy about. However, the suspension of habeas corpus, the suspension of any other constitutionally guaranteed rights is why you call someone a terrorist. And I don't think that expanding that category can move us toward any kind of, as you say, non-normative or counter-abusive frameworks. But I do get the appeal rhetorically.
I agree with you. I did have quite the back and forth with the organizers. I wasn't trying to disrupt any, protest activity. I just wanted to know the utility of that kind of repurposing on the ground, in relation to this particular moment. Does it serve us? Where does it serve us? Maybe the question is more, where does it serve us to invert these discourses, or to redeploy them, or to instrumentalize them, right? Because Zionism is terrorism. It was a great banner. It was a great looking banner, and people referred to it, right? It started becoming a kind of catchphrase in the immediacy of that gathering. So, but I'm with you.
You're reminding me of a sign I saw at Occupy. In fact, a sign I was handed at Occupy that said, "Who polices the police?" And I just like started carrying it, and then I was walking with it, and then somebody sent me a picture of myself in the march later, and I was like, "Oh God, no policing of any, like, no, oh no."
Yeah.
I mean, what works on a sign is also like, I'm not so, like, to me, that's great. I think, yeah.
I was thinking about, your description of how these, these categories come about, right? And they're always through states of exception, right? Which is something we did talk a lot about post 9/11. It's something that's also kind of disappeared from discourse, states of exception. Yet there's been a normalization of states of the actuality of continual states of exception, right? We've come to accept that governance is constantly going to exceed its legality and give itself permission to exceed that legality. We've just seen that over and over again with Trump, right? I mean, he's kind of the par excellence, state of exception, dude. One of the other reasons why I think this is problematic is precisely because of gender. That the configuration of the terrorist has certain kinds of gendered and gendered, components, elements, what have you. And, there's a reiteration of the kind of the feminization, right, of certain kinds of terrorist bodies, and the subjugation therein of those bodies because of that feminization. So that was something else that I tried to that I did talk to them about. I was interested in your invocation of the ethical. I've been thinking about this a lot recently. I was reading something that Denise Ferreira da Silva wrote about Black Lives Matter a couple of years ago, and she has this sentence that's really been haunting me. She says that she's interested in the ethical indifference with which racial violence is met. And so, I think she lays out the argument for ethics as being a kind of dead zone now for agency, for politics, for political mobilization, right? We can't call for ethical action or ethical participation because we wouldn't be here if that actually was a call that people heeded. So I was kind of interested, there's been lots of statements and they've all been beautiful and amazing. But the ones that call for like a kind of moral and ethical response to what's happening right now in Palestine seem to me to kind of continue to play into this kind of Western political subjectivity, right? That's a kind of a normative subjectivity that's like, yes, it's important to me to produce myself as an ethical subject. Anyway, I just wanted to highlight that because I have really been thinking about her notion of ethical indifference, which seemingly would be an oxymoron, right? But but anyway, that's just a side thing. I don't know how much time we have, Andrea.
I mean, I think like 10 would be our hard cutoff probably for everyone who's working the event tonight. We only have had one question come into the chat, so I feel excited about you continuing to have your conversation.
Okay. Did you want to say something, Anjuli?
I could wind my way toward that question in the chat, but I also wanted to pick up on a couple of things about ethical indifference. We're not interrupted. We're happy to talk about questions. I mean, I just wanted to, I think as far as I've gotten in this like forest of questions about ethics, I mean, first of all, it's like weirdly like returned me to Hobbes in some ways, like what do we believe about,
right.
About each other? I mean, the path to walk to me seems to be between again, it's a historical question, like the ethics of care and the ethics of responsibility were such an important driver of imperial occupation. And so and then the mobilization of responsibility to protect in terms of interventions all over North Africa and in the Middle East, which are really just soft cover for fucking bombing campaigns. That language makes me nervous and itchy and for those specific historical reasons. On the other hand, it's incredibly disheartening and dispiriting. I mean, this kind of throws me back to just pedagogy. It's incredibly disheartening and dispiriting to see students pick up on what I think happens around, I mean, how to say this, just like TV political debates where the terms have nothing to do with anything we could even remotely call moral or ethical. They're just point scoring operations about abstract terms like justice. So on that score, pedagogically, I feel like ethics provides us a lot more of a nuanced conversation to have than justice does. Justice doesn't seem to get us anywhere. Justice gives us the sense that Palestine and Israel are symmetrically armed states, right, that are having a war. That justice discourse is a dead end. So yeah, I'm like warm to the idea of an ethical way of talking about this, but I also worry about the history there.
Yeah, when you were talking, I was just thinking about, along with justice, the emptiness of decolonization is being made clear. And so Mesna Keto was talking about this today, and she called decolonization in the US Academy a form, let me see if I can reproduce this, a domestication and a reforming of I can't pull it up, but it was so smart in the way that it offered us a kind of people have been saying this, this term has become ubiquitous, it's everywhere, so, and it's everything, so it means nothing, all of that stuff, the kind of emptying out of a conceptual frame, right? But this was a little bit different from that, which was just, it wasn't so much about the circulation and what happens, when a concept becomes commodified in that way. It was really about, hey, this is decolonization happening in Palestine. And what did you think decolonization was? What did you think it was going to look like?
Throwing red paint on the Teddy Roosevelt statue in front of the Natural History Museum. The end.
So that's kind of resonant with your comments about justice. Care, abuse. So this is also something that, there's two things that I think, and one, that there's been a kind of resurgence around, or surging around, conversations like care is this new thing that everyone's discovered, right? Because of the pandemic. We learned all of these new things about caring about each other, wearing a mask, is a form of care, et cetera. And, two reasons why I'm not into it is, one, precisely the historical reasons you talk about. Care and abuse are hand in hand. But the other thing too is that, the conversations around care have been longstanding in critical disability studies, right? And then kind of this understanding of crip theory. So there's been a kind of appropriation without even noticing of actual, we could say, ethics of care that have been elaborated by many disability justice folks, as well as people working in critical disability studies. However, yet again, the question of abuse doesn't really come up in those conversations either, right? So there's always a kind of missing component of this conversation around care, whether there's always a kind of romanticization of it in some sense, I think.
Missing component reminds me of the phantom beat you were talking about. Also, there's like that interval.
I wanted to maybe this could be the last kind of point or question, but I wanted to talk about your writing style and your writing process. And the book is so beautifully written. And so after and it's such a pleasure to read, which is weird to say because it's also talking about really horrible forms of violence, really. After reading it, it didn't surprise me at all to learn that you also write poetry. You know, I think about my own writing, you know, in terms of like biopolitical state violence. I think of it as pretty artless. It's kind of, you know, there's a kind of like thudding determination in my prose, which is just like almost the thudding determination of the violence itself, right? It just it keeps going on, and there it is, another one. I was thinking also about Andrea's extra transmission, right? Which to me is also an articulation of militancy that's so creative, that, you know, has a kind of porosity of language, but still a kind of affective connection to, you know, militancy, and also a way of talking about violence, right? Without reifying it, without making it one thing, without reducing it. My own issue is just about how to write about violence without performatively reiterating it. And that's why I'm kind of moving away from kind of analyses or diagnostics of state violence, right? Because in the kind of, in the Palestine context, you know, how many people have described Israeli state violence, right? And it doesn't really shift the terrain of it doesn't really describing that violence doesn't seem to penetrate in some ways, right? It just keeps reiterating the power of settler colonialism, right, in this context. So I am trying to move away from this. This is my own experience, but my experience with your book is just this kind of coming together of aesthetics and beauty and violence. Not so much the aestheticization of violence. I don't mean anything so reductive, but I was wondering about the poeticization of violence, or even what you find poetic about violence, if that's not crude to say. There's something about the porosity of your writing that allows for a different kind of experience of what you're describing, meaning a different kind of experience than the kind of thudding, you know, kind of consistent thudding of like the right to Maim, right? There's in the book, there's these moments where one feels like one is reading poetry, right? So I'm interested in how you approach these questions of writing, because you have kind of multiple you know, modes and avenues of writing, and I'm interested in the kind of in and out, like switching in and out of modes, or are these instinctual, or what are your approaches?
Oh God, no, they're not instinctual at all. I think my diagnosis from over here would be that you are extremely good at argument. And so when I read you, I feel like I'm in extremely capable hands. Like I know what you're trying to say. I never know what I'm trying to say. And part of what happened with this book is that, well, one of my advisors laughed at me in a chapter meeting. So I never had a chapter meeting again. He was like, this is insane. You're not writing poetry. And I hadn't been writing poetry. And I just, you know, I want to, like, the incredible energy to go back to Andrea's collection, Extra Transmission. Andrea, pin yourself and come in, so we can talk about this. But that incredible like velocity and energy in your poetry, that's something I see that the two of you really share. And it's something that I'm always striving for in my writing, but it doesn't come naturally. So I think what I wound up doing was just shuttling back and forth, which actually was really, really good for my academic writing. Putting the craziness of how I wanted to write into another place that was poetry made my academic writing much cleaner. So if you can imagine, before this, it was much more insufferable. And my advisors truly had a hard time getting me to just say what I meant. So that breaking those two things apart, but there's a kernel also of something theoretically important to me in your question, which is that the poetics of violence, that's a really serious matter to me. And it comes directly out of Fennell. It comes directly out of the moment in the Wretched of the Earth, where he's talking about I write about this in the 5th chapter a little bit, but he's talking about violence as pure mediation. And he's saying, like, if you want to be a revolutionary, you have to be ready to put your body on the line. Everything has to be staked. It's a totally Hegelian argument. And then he goes immediately to a César play. So his example of violence is this literary text. And I have taught that scene, those pages, so many times, and I've thought about them so much. And I think in the end, I just don't think that violence and poesis are different things. And which also means I don't think revolution and poesis are different things.
Mhm.
But I think this would be a fun moment to make this a 3-way conversation. Andrea, if you want to say a little bit about your violent and amazing and velocitous writing.
Thank you so much for inviting me on. Getting to hear you both in conversation is just such a gift. I actually want to tell a story about an experience I had in my MFA workshop where I began writing the Kilborough poems that make up the section of the book Kilborough Kill Cop. And my professor was like, "These are violent. Like, what are you doing?" And I was, one of my colleagues who's a good friend of mine, one of my classmates who's a good friend of mine, my Sidwan, said, "Well, bros are violent. Like, we are able to act in response to violence," which is, returns to Fanon, of course, talking about how the colonized have to use violence, like the requirement of violence to overthrow the colonizer. And there's been a lot of, some people are, they get riled up and upset with the intensity of the violence in a lot of my poetry and my work. And then it's just not for them. I mean, frankly. And I've been thinking about, like, trying to talk about, like, what is the, like, form, like, what is the craft? And I'm seeing it as, like, immediate direct guerrilla strikes, which in certain contexts, it, like, in the wrong hands is a terribly awful thing, but in other hands it can be a powerful abolitionist thing.
I think it's so magical too. And I'm thinking about, like, the BPMs of both of your writing being kind of like on the same, like, what I want at the end of my run level. But it's also amazing to get someone's heart to quicken, like, on the page. And I think those acts of guerrilla strike that you're talking about, like, I mean, one of the simplest ways I talk to my students about how poetry, like, is material is that it can, like, it, like, makes your, like, when you're watching basketball on TV and you're like, whoa, 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 like, it makes you, it's a representation that, like, makes you move or makes you flush or makes you scared, or that's wild. I mean, it's the simplest thing, but it's so wild when it happens to you. Or when you can make it happen to somebody else.
I just wanted to say, Andrea, I love extra transmission so much. And of course I love it because it's so violent, because I believe in naming these things, right? That's why I wrote a book called The Right to Maim. It is about being specific and direct about the lexicon of violence and the praxis of it as well. So, that was the thing that kind of caught me immediately, was the kind of perverse relationship to violence, and what I thought was a perverse relationship between violence and poetry, but now I'm being schooled as to how that's not actually true through both of your work. I wanted to say that I did take a poetry class while we were working from home this past semester, and it was I was terrified completely terrified. I won't say where and with who, because it's embarrassing to me. But I realized that, I'm good with analyzing discourse, but I'm not so good with language. These are different kinds of skills, which is why, Anjuli, I was curious as to how you kind of move in and out of those modes, because regardless of how you separated, the tasks out, the poetry with the scholarship, the facility with language is really different than discourse analysis, right? Which is something that I had to learn in this poetry class that I hadn't really registered before. I was embarrassed to not have registered that before. So I wanted to share that story as well.
I'm very, very glad that you did that. I hope it's the first of many. I've never taken a poetry class. I should have been in your class. It would be great.
It was embarrassing.
There's no part of poetry that isn't embarrassing, though. I really think that, like, it's just like you just get used to being embarrassed.
Yeah,
I'm kind of into like
though.
shame. Sorry, I'm kind of
Go
into
ahead.
shamelessness as like a way of living and a creative practice. So I've kind of like shed embarrassment from things. So maybe you will do the same in your next poetry class.
We'll see if there's a next poetry class. I'm working on it. Do we want to open up, or? Oh, I actually wanted to say again that the dysfluency keeps coming back to me as well, and the question of stuttering and just you know, again, the way that you kind of put, you know, are thinking about redaction, dysfluency, and the kind of utterance that you talked about. All of these modalities of both speech containment and expression, right, simultaneously, was really powerful, I thought.
I really thought that you would love that. I think I maybe already even sent you the essay, but I'll send it to you again. It's beautiful. He's such a beautiful, beautiful writer. And that work made me think of your work so much. Like, it's such a, it's just a really generous and generative way of thinking about form and disability, I think. Literary form and disability. I can say something about Carrie's question, and then maybe if anybody else has questions while I'm talking this through, put them in the chat, and then I think we'll let everybody rest at the end of a long and tough week. So I don't have an interesting answer to this question. I just didn't want to leave it hanging. I just love Song of Solomon. I started if anybody's not looking at the chat, the question is just about the poem Quranic Asterisk and the fragments from Song of Solomon, and talking about my engagement with Song of Solomon and whether it has any special relationship to my work on coloniality and discourses of terrorism, race, and epidemiology. And the answer is not really. Like, I really love the Geneva Bible. It's one of the first translations of the Bible into English before the King James, and it comes with all these, I have it in facsimile edition, and there's all this like marginalia in it. So to me, that's like already an intertextual version of Song of Solomon with like commentary from Puritans who wanted the Bible to exist in English. I love the Toni Morrison novel, and it's really like the sexy part of the Bible. It's like super gay and like super hot, and I think about it all the time. It's probably pre-Abrahamic, so it's like poetry that's like devotional and erotic, and it just like happens to be in the Bible, and it's so super doesn't fit there. So it's like obviously my favorite part. It doesn't have any special relationship to the other work on coloniality, but I think in a big way, it's one of the pieces of that corporately authored text that feels extremely oriental. Like, it has this kind of fascinating mix of placedness, and it's super hard to imagine if you read it in isolation that has anything to do with like Western culture. So for me, it's one of those great texts that, like Homer, gives the lie to Western civilization completely, where if you read it carefully, you're like, this has nothing to do with white people. Like, this is just like awesome. So that's my few lines on Song of Solomon. I would say it's really short. You should read it. It's not like one of those long, boring books of the Bible. Everybody should go read it and enjoy your Friday night.
I'm not seeing any more questions pop up, but I would love to hear, Anjuli, what work you have in progress and what's next for you before we sign off.
The big thing, and maybe this answers a little bit Jasbir's question, or the big thing. So I'm working on a book-length documentary poem about the Indus Waters Treaty of 1960, trying to sort out one of the chapters in my new academic book, which is about commodities, special commodities. So labor is the kind of overarching commodity, and then there are 3 chapters on sugar, water, and world literature. And so the Indus Waters poem is kind of research and kind of putting my like messy writing into a poem form. I just finished this collection, which Andrea has really generously read for me. And then I think the next big thing on the docket is 3 books that are all about the life sciences in the colonies. So a book on zoology, one on geology, and one on botany, thinking basically about the origins of bioprospecting and what has become of our imperial ecological catastrophe of a present. But who knows? It turned out that writing about medicine was a lot more kind of relevant than I thought it was going to be. So it may be a few more years of going back through. There's so much research for a book like this that never makes it into the book. So I think I might revive some of those old projects too, because there's a lot on the cutting room floor about medical and epidemic history.
Wow. Thank you so much. Well, to our audience, you better get started because Julie's about to write like 6 more books. So I encourage you to order Epidemic Empire with the 25% discount. Corey, if you could drop the link in the chat again, that would be amazing. And Julie, Jasbir, thank you so much. This event will be captioned and then posted on our website for everyone to watch over and over again. Your conversation was so rich, and Anjuli, your lecture and reading was honestly legendary. So thank you so much for your generosity and your brilliance.
Thanks, you both. Let's go for a walk soon.
Absolutely. And thank you all to our audience and Poetry Project staff for being here, and have an excellent weekend. Take care.
Thank you. Good night, everyone. Thanks, Corey, Laura, and James.